They moved me up from being a backup speaker to speaking the one after lunch. So, yay, no pressure, big improvement, right? So I'm like coming out of like the minor league bullpen into like a World Series playoff game. So, good luck. So I'm Steve Becker. I work at Berkeley College, right? So that is not UC Berkeley. That is not the Berkeley School of Music. That's not the Berkeley College at Yale. It's the other Berkeley College. And that kind of, we're in New York and New Jersey. So that makes some very interesting threat models because everyone seems to not really like UC Berkeley right now. So we get a lot of interesting hate mail and things like that, which you'll hear me talk about a little later. I've been doing some different IT and InfoSec stuff for a while, so I have some cool stories. You can see I make fun of the certifications like everyone else does, but I also am shamelessly going to plug if anybody wants to come help fix the problems with certifications. I do a lot of work with CompTIA to change their knowledge domains and actually write questions for them. If anyone has questions about how to join that process and actually fix the problems rather than just calling them out, come talk to me later. So now we're going to dig into this actual talk. A quick background about social engineering itself to start with, because this is predominantly going to be about phishing, right? It's just getting somebody to do something that they probably shouldn't do. I think that's a pretty obvious thing, but just so that we're all on the same page, we're all talking about the same stuff here. It includes a lot of different kind of confidence tricks, like quid pro quos. You could literally buy something from somebody if that's your choice. It's all these different kinds of like tailgating when you walk in a door behind somebody too closely. There's obviously phishing, voice phishing, spear phishing, whaling, which is targeting CEOs, other presidents, high-level targets. You could even text-based phishing, SMS networks. And of course, phishing is so important to talk about because according, the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report is kind of one of the standard resources that gets cited for these things. Phishing is the number 3 cause of incidents that are investigated and the number 3 cause of breaches. Interestingly, stolen credentials is actually number 1, but kind of phishing and stolen credentials go together, so I'm not 100% sure why they split them in weird ways. The really important part about this is 17% of these actually get reported to the IT departments, help desk, other kind of the infrastructure that you have set up to actually correct these problems. And what we're going to talk about now is how and why we could fix that. And of course, the important reason we do that in phishing is because before you even know this happens, it's not getting reported to you, right? So before you know this is happening in your environment, an attacker is going to dump the data, they're going to reuse your credentials in other places if they can, they're going to reset passwords, other information, and if you use single sign-on for, if you have 10 different services behind the same single sign-on account, they're just going to repeat that for all of your services again and again. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the basic prevention and detection, and it's training. I mean, everyone remembers Steve Ballmer's developer. I'm just sitting up here training. Now we're going to dig really quickly into 4 case studies that we're going to talk about how phishing actually has impacted organizations. And this is a quick little legal note to say, you can't really prove it was anybody I actually worked for because I've done a lot of consulting and different things. And I've worked with some local peers of mine in some smaller organizations that might need assistance. So you can't actually discover who these victims were in case there's still legal cases pending. And in some cases, you'll see why in a minute why that is the case. The first case study is just a simple, straightforward phishing attempt, right? So somebody targets some low-level employees at a company, says, it's an executive, CEO, president, hey, I need you to do XYZ for me. You need to log into this website. Could come from the help desk saying you need to re-log in to confirm your account still exists. All these kind of basic things that we talk about all the time. And in this case, I don't think they found anything to actually monetize or steal, right? So they just dumped some strategy documents that they found because it was this low-level employee, so they put it on like a pastebin website. And if any of you have ever tried to search pastebin for these kind of dumps, it gets very difficult. Their indexing engines run at weird times and in weird ways. So the biggest recommendation I have here is to join your industry's Information Sharing and Analyst Center, right, in ISAC. My case working for a school, we're a member of the Research and Education Network ISAC, or in ISAC. There's one for almost every major industry out there. Some of them get expensive to join, but it's highly recommended because they'll have a lot more resources than like somebody like myself has. Again, because I'm not UC Berkeley with all their academic budgets like they have. So this is kind of just an obvious phishing attempt, right? But And the last point I want to make there is there's also an unknown social media account in this case that said, hey, I found your data on Pigspin, right? So that's how we found out this happened. So the person that fell for the phishing attack, other people who got the phishing attack didn't report it to us. We didn't know until somebody literally told us, hey, your information is out there. And that's way too late to do anything about it. It's Pandora's box has already been opened. So you want to also partner with maybe your marketing department or whoever manages your social media accounts so that they can scan Twitter and things like that for you if you don't have the capability. A second case study is they used somebody's password as ransom proof, right? We've all seen these messages, send, some Bitcoin, whatever, to this address because we have, your webcam was turned on, we saw what you're doing, all these things. And you'll start seeing the crossover into a lot of the emotional response now where you don't necessarily know what that person actually does at home, right? That's scary, right? Because a lot of these people might think it's real. They might have done something that actually is being talked about in this email. This is why these attackers and these malicious people use these pretexts, because they work, because they're real. They're real things that people do in private, right? So it's a very delicate, very sensitive situation to be in, and it causes a lot of people to not report these incidents because they're embarrassed or afraid of what's going to happen. So you need to break down those walls between the IT organization, your security organization, and the people that need to do the reporting. A lot of times you'll see the email addresses that are used for these attacks in a website like haveibeenpwned.com that just lists kind of the aggregate of other breaches. Obviously, the actual passwords aren't seen there. It's just you can quickly tell whether it's whether that person's a victim of another breach or not. And you see that quite frequently. A third case study, and this is one of the ones where the names are changed to protect the innocent kind of thing, right? An important announcement is received from a president, CEO, could be the help desk, whatever. You need to change something in whatever account, right? The phished employee, in this case, immediately had their direct deposit information changed. Not a request to HR, to payroll, to change it, but they actually logged into the HR payroll system and changed it to a fake bank so they could steal money directly, right? This happened 2 days before payroll cycle, so they knew what our payroll schedule was. This also happened in such a manner that they knew exactly how to do it in this payroll system within minutes of the person falling for this phishing attack. Luckily, in this company's case, there was a dual control set up, so that person, the policy is for payroll department to call that person's phone and say, did you want to make this change? Is this legitimate? And then they have to provide a voided check or a statement from the bank. That extra layer of control saved it from actually happening. One of the reasons why this attack was able to happen in this manner is, does anybody have a company that any of your vendors, partners, you publicly release that information and do like a PR campaign in exchange maybe for a discount or some sort of special treatment, right? Say, hey, our company uses this awesome payroll system, so now you're you appear on their website as one of their valued customers. That's an invitation to hackers and that these different attackers to know exactly what system they're going to abuse if they reach out to your organization. So it's a double-edged sword. You want people to know that you're using the best-of-breed software, all these different tools, services, but you're also opening the door to set up these pretexts, and people know exactly what to say to get your colleagues to fall for it, right? So obviously the biggest thing you can do here is set up multi-factor authentication on these systems, do these out-of-band communication methods, and one of the key takeaways for me personally is the person who fell for it, one of the people actually, there was a handful of people that actually fell for this. It was a very well-coordinated, conducted attack. Called me crying in tears, which this person is actually the inspiration for this talk, right? They were so distraught and so worried about what would happen to their personal information because now this person had access to the HR system. They could access credit reports with their social security numbers, all these different things that are absolutely terrifying to most people. And they went through this whole remediation process of having to change bank accounts. They got, I think they went a little too far to the extreme, right? They wanted to change bank accounts. They actually looked into the process of having their social security number changed, which is a whole different talk because that's not easy to do. And that became a really big way for me to change how I thought about these attacks, more from the victim side and how to get them more engaged in the process. The last one is the most interesting, of course. A foreign factory somewhere in a big country in Asia, right? Was successfully phished. The really crazy thing here is that they just redirected payment information to, the attacker's bank account, which was going to get money laundering through some different Pacific Rim countries. It's a very common tactic for them to launder money in that way. The really crazy thing is that last line there. The factory thought the payments were being held by a bank because they were basically modifying messages in transit because they could just intercept it, right? They had the login credentials for email. So the people on the factory side thought they weren't getting paid. The people on the buying side thought they just weren't getting shipments. But they even had fake shipment, a website spun up in Amazon, EC2, because it's trivial for them to do that, right? So they provided fake tracking numbers. So right? Let's think about that. They went through such an effort. It took 3 months for this attack to get detected because they said, oh, yeah, your shipment's being sent over the ocean, right? So on a boat. It takes a little while to get here from Asia, right? Then, oh, yeah, it's getting held in customs. They need to do extra scanning, all this different stuff. 3 months. And I think it was like $300,000 that got stolen in this case. So, I mean, just think about this. So this company now is out the $300,000 for the product, and they don't have the product to sell to make that money back. So now the accounts payable person who was responsible for this in the end, right, is absolutely terrified for their job because they basically could have bankrupted the whole company. So that's another way you have to look at the response from that victim's perspective, because now you have to do all this research into what they actually did and how to prevent it in the future. So now you have to deal with them on a very intimate, personal level to figure out how to get those funds back. And wire transfers, once the money's out of the other account, it's basically impossible to reverse that wire transfer, right? In this case, knowledge about how your insurance policies are written and how you can go about that actually is helpful. In this case, it was against their internal policy to change the wire transfer information without that out-of-band communication method. So when the accounts payable person didn't do that because of time differences and the other pretexting in the emails, right? They were able to get it covered by an error and omission insurance rather, just basically their general umbrella policy, right? So this wasn't really a cybersecurity problem because they weren't hacked or compromised because it was the factory side that was. So they were able to get some money back in a different route. So being well-rounded in some of those other areas is important for this incident response, which is where we're going to talk about now. A quick little thing about, there's a big difference, right, between a regular incident response and information security, or network security especially, compared to phishing. Mostly because you need so much more training and so much more involvement of the actual victim in a phishing incident response than you do in the more traditional incident response policy or program, right? Basically, the problem is you can't contain an attack. Once your information is leaked out to the internet, it's gone, right? And it's almost impossible to detect unless other people are reporting those phishing attacks until something bad has happened. And of course, there's two different viewpoints to this too. On the corporate side, people are going to want to know how you let it happen. How did that bad email get past your email filtering? How did you let that person go to that bad website? How didn't you know that was a bad website? How are you going to cover the loss? Is the insurance cover going to cover it? But you also have to remember that there's that human being involved, and they're your colleague or your boss, your friend. I mean, this could happen to your family members in some different capacities, and they're absolutely terrified of what might happen to them, to their company, to their personal information. And that really changes your outlook on how you're going to deal with incident response. So just to be, fully, to get the whole picture here, right? There is this corporate business response, right? Where you need to have all those detective controls, all your log files, because otherwise you won't really know what happened with any kind of assurance. You need to corroborate what the person is saying happened with actual evidence, right? So then you can determine if anything was changed, what alterations were made to your data, what they stole. I mean, that's pretty straightforward incident response. The big thing here is that you have to remember whatever personal bias you have against that victim is absolutely critical to ignore, right? As soon as you start victim shaming or blaming somebody for falling for these attack types, they're not going to be your friend anymore. When you lose that connection, they won't help you in the reporting process or the recovery process, which is what we're going to talk about now. These are increasingly very sophisticated attacks that people are falling for. This generic kind of phishing, blanket phishing attacks are slightly easier to detect by a lot of these new machine learning nonsense, whatever, right? So when they start getting more and more targeted, this is when you're going to have a lot more problems. When you place that blame on that victim again, they're going to tell you the wrong thing, they're going to lie to you, they're not going to want to deal with you, and then you're not going to be able to actually fix the problem. And that decreases their involvement in the entire process, and you just have a much harder time as you move further. So, going back to that kind of generic incident response cycle, right? Preparation. That's really the key of where this starts. And I think that the best way to do that is to increase your positive visibility as a security organization, right? You don't want to talk about what you did to increase security. The average person that works in accounting or sales or whatever department in your company doesn't want to hear how about you switched to a longer key space in your encryption methodology. They don't understand what any of that means. All they want to know is, if they upload something to a vendor, how do they do it securely? So if you come up with a new system that lets them send their vendors, if you have printed material, we see that a lot where I am. These files are very, very big because of the vector images, all this different stuff, right? If we have an easy way for them to send it, they're very happy. That's so that we avoid them using things like Dropbox or these other systems that have all these other inherent problems to us. So you want to talk about good business use cases that are also secure, not just the security stuff that the average person isn't going to really worry about. And of course, again, training, right? Especially when you do test phishes. So you don't want to necessarily attack that person who falls for the test. It just lets you know who the most likely people are to fall for them, and you can work with them closer. That's really the key takeaway from the training. And of course, this is one of my favorite tweets. Buy your help desk lunch, right? If you need a good relationship with your help desk, because on average your support staff has the best relationship, hopefully, if you work at a good organization, right? They have a good relationship with your entire customer base also. That relationship is really what you want to exploit, right? So just think of it as like hacking in reverse, right? You want to be able to have that positive relationship that they already get from a good support experience to also be more comfortable reporting all these different kinds of attack types, which we move into in the next part of the incident response, right? Detection. So do the people who fall for these attacks or receive other kinds of phishing emails, do they report it? And how can you help them, right? So what logs do you have available, right? How do you identify more victims? So how does support staff escalate that? And that's really where it comes in, is working with your help desk and your support staff lets you know what other victims you have and lets you better answer, especially when you start preparing for a lot of false positives, right? There's a big difference between spam email, somebody signing up for a newsletter they forgot they signed up for 3 years ago, and this is going to be you all day long. Just all day. And you know what? You can never, ever be annoyed at somebody for thinking they're doing the right thing. As soon as you act annoyed and bothered by somebody coming to you, you shut that relationship down again. And then you have to start right back at the beginning, proving that you're actually doing something positive for them. Now, of course, everyone at some point is going to fall for something somewhere, right? So how do you work with these people? And, the entire point of social engineering is when you convince somebody is a sense of urgency, right? So they want you to act quickly to make some sort of change. So it has nothing to do with your intelligence level. You have every level of person, and they're going to fall for something if it's targeted perfectly for them. So it's just them being distracted for that moment, right? And a big thing, and don't call people users, right? No one wants to be called a user unless apparently the only people who can get away with that are IT and drug dealers, right? So don't do that. I also, I think colleague, a lot of people, depending on what your industry is, maybe you'll call them peers, associates. There's all these different terms different organizations use. Friend with whom I work. I don't even know if I'm using whom right there, but he's wearing a monocle and it sounded fancy, so I did it. You really need to build on that relationship, and that's another way, is calling people by something they want to be called, right? And that enables them to actually report things to you. Another thing that is a huge improvement in your incident response is working with them, no matter what their level of involvement is. Even if you just ask them, hey, can you change your own password? Rather than forcing a password reset. And now you should probably monitor to make sure they actually do it, because they also don't restart the computers when they say they do. But ask them to do it themselves rather than forcing them to do it. That tiny little bit of involvement gives them a sense of ownership of fixing their problem. Again, remember, they're scared that something bad is going to happen to them. So if you involve them in the fixing process, right, they're a lot more likely to actually be part of the fixing process. And you don't know how much more information you're going to need out of them until you start digging through those other log files that we talked about, right? When you start seeing those problems where maybe you have a gap in your log file, if somebody opens up this email on their phone or something from home, you might not have like a DNS entry yet from their office computer. You don't have the firewall logs to know what website they went to, whether they actually clicked, whether they actually submitted information. So you really need to keep that relationship close. I keep repeating that because it's absolutely critical if you want a better outcome from your phishing attacks. because culture is everything, right? So I like to turn these bad things into positive outcomes, right? So if somebody was able to detect a phishing attack, report it to us, and we were able to correct the problem before it was released to the public or something really bad happened, those people then become our security champions, for lack of a better way to say it. And that kind of spreads that culture for you, because that little pocket, they all have 4 or 5 people that they work with. They have 4 or 5 friends that they've worked with all these different things. And it spreads throughout your company in a much different way. And you have to continually want to see that change. And you have to continually be better than you were the day before in making that change happen. Because if you're not consistent with that, it doesn't actually come to fruition. You act annoyed once, and that's what people remember. When you're positive all the time, even if they send you a newsletter rather than an actual phishing attempt, they're going to remember that too. And finally, I think one of the keys for working with these people that actually fell for these attacks is the personal response side, right? So, and you can't see this, if they use MFA on Facebook, they won't complain about corporate MFA, right? Because they understand the intrinsic value it has to them personally. And it's much easier for them to see the value it has to your company if they already see the personal side. So when you work with these people and you start saying, oh, you should use multi-factor authentication, or you should use a password manager, well, you're going to recommend 1Password, you're going to recommend LastPass, KeyPass, all these different things. And I don't think the best strategy is to tell them exactly what to do, because what works for you and what you're used to doing will not work for everybody else. It will not work for your colleagues who don't have the same technical aptitude. It won't work for your parents, right? Like my mom still writes all of her passwords down in a notebook. That's not a problem. In my company, it would be a problem because people have access to different desks, things like that. No one goes in her desk drawer to look at this notebook, right? So it works, and it's safe and secure. So you need to know what you can do to empower those choices at a personal level. So, how many people have parents that don't have different passwords for all their different accounts, right? Most people, right? In my case, I convinced my mom to do it by having her just write it down. She never forgets it. She never needs to reset her password. Now, when she gets a password reset email saying, hey, you need to reset, she knows it's junk. So you need to really empower people to make those right choices for themselves. And that's them owning that part of the security that then comes back into your corporate world too. And another thing too is, if you can't explain the topics you're talking about to them, obviously they're going to have a little bit of problem believing you in other areas, right? So preparation, even as you're working through the other processes of the incident response life cycle, right? It's important to remember to be prepared. And then, of course, we have the post-incident problems, right? So how are you going to prevent it from happening again? Because if it's happened once, it'll happen twice, it'll happen 3 times. It's unavoidable, in my opinion, in the kind of internet-based culture that we have now, right? It's too common for people to use these attack methods to really do harm to organizations. So you really want to use those security champions, right? Those people that have that little pocket of ownership of security will help spread throughout your organization, and more people will own security, and then it's free staff augmentation, right? And who wouldn't want to do less work? Granted, you'll have to do more of deciding, no, that's not really phishing, it's spam, but that's a small price to pay for not actually having as many phishing incidents. A huge, huge thing is when you start doing this training again and again and again, you're seeing it in more organizations where people are doing it even more often than yearly. There's a lot of regulations that you have to do it every year. I think that's not always frequent enough in a lot of cases. Use these examples. Obviously, don't name names and make people embarrassed, because that defeats the whole purpose of what we just talked about, right? But you should use real examples in your training. And they'll know that it happened to your company, and they'll know that it could happen to them. They won't be nearly as embarrassed when something does happen, and they'll actually report it to you. When they actually report it to you, you can do something to help them, right? That's the entire point. Of course, when you're looking at how did your support staff and your other security staff, should you be lucky enough to have any other security staff, how did you react to their incident, right? And that's a huge way that you can improve the culture. Is if you fix the way the support staff and your security staff handled it, it'll trickle down into all other groups. And people, that information spreads through back channels in your organization, right? If they have a bad experience, they're going to tell their peers, their colleagues, right? If they have good experiences, they might do that too. And that's really important, because I keep repeating it. And of course, you have to tune your logs and different reporting frequencies, because you might be able to catch other attack types once you have indicators of compromise, right? That's one of the key takeaways here to me too, is if you get one person that gets targeted at a phishing attack, right? They're probably going to fall for it. When one person gets targeted, there's going to be such a perfect pretext. They are not going to be able to not click that button. It's just, that's how human beings are built, right? If you get 5 people, 10 people get the email, which is much more common, right? An attacker wants a higher chance of success. That also increases your chance of detection. Because all you really need is 10%, right? If 10% of your colleagues, your customer base, whatever the situation is, report phishing attempts, that means 1 out of every 10. You can take that information. The 10 emails that you got are probably using the same, some other kind of header, some other kind of metadata you can look at for these indicators of compromise, and you'll find the person who did fall for it because one other person reported it and didn't fall for it. And that's your biggest way to actually detect these things are happening in your environment. So now we can open up to some key takeaways, contact information, and I know it's kind of a running trope at this point to say thanks for coming to my TED Talk, but this was not technical at all, which makes it feel like a TED Talk. And of course, I do want to take one quick second to say what a great job a lot of the volunteers and staff here are doing with this. Staying at the hotel, I came down from New Jersey yesterday. They were working at crazy hours last night to make this event actually happen, so I'm going to give a quick round of applause to all of them for doing it. So if anybody has any questions, anything they want to talk about, I'm up here. I'll be wandering around for a while. So, anybody? Oh, yep. Sorry, the light's a little funky. Go ahead. Yeah. So a product like KnowBe4, I think there's a lot of products like that. I think any of them are good, right? Anything that you can do to find out who the most vulnerable people are in your organization, the people who are most likely to fall for those phishing attempts. I assume we're talking about the capability to send fake phishes, right? You can work with those people to explain to them, what the dangers are, and then you also have a better chance. Like I said, if you get one person that reports it, if one of those people that hasn't done well on the phishing tests, you can look more closely at them. Depending on the size of your organization, it scales a little bit differently. If you have a smaller organization, it's easy, right? You can say, hey, I know this one person got it. I know this other person's likely to fall for something. Let's make sure they didn't get it too. So I think it's better to use that for statistical data than it is to use it to reprimand people, things like that. I think one thing I've heard of some companies doing, and I'm a big supporter of it, is if you take a certain percentage of the people who reported that the KnowBe4 phishing attempt, send them a gift card. Like $5 at Starbucks, people go bananas for a cup of coffee, right? Like, absolutely blows their mind. And it costs an organization, even if you send out 100 of them, that's $500. So, depending on the size of the organization, $500 could be 10% of the people who reported something from something like KnowBe4, and you're going to get a huge increase in people who report things because they get that response that maybe they'll send me something. And we haven't done that at my organization right now. But what we have done is the people who do report real phishing attempts, if it's one that could have caused us a real material loss, send them $15, $20 to Starbucks, and they cannot believe we did that. Well, we're just doing our job. Like, no, you actually did something way better than the other 15 people who didn't report it. And then they tell the 15 other people, as it comes across through those lunchroom conversations, IT staff sent me a gift card. I'm like, for what? I'm like, well, I reported an email. And then, of course, for the next 2 weeks after we do that, we get 400 spam messages. And I love each and every one of them because that increases our chance of actually fixing the phishing problem. So I'm hoping that was a really long-winded answer to your question. Anybody else? Oh, go ahead. Somebody was right. The light's really... Yeah, I just see a hand in the air because the light... Sorry. So how do we keep leadership from actually blaming people? Luckily, I work for an organization that lets me not blame people. That's a really good question. I think in a lot of cases, it's just explaining to them what the risks in that are and taking something like the information we talked about today and bringing it back to them and saying, if we convince people by our actions to not report things, here's what's going to happen. Here's what happens when people don't report things. So it's like anything else in security. It's a lot of luck that you get the buy-in that you need from the people above. Sorry, that's not a better answer. That's the honest truth, though.